Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon and welcome to this sixth and last seminar at our annual meeting. We've talked about food security, gender, diversity, and inclusion today. And now we are going into something that is a new topic today, which is the climate crisis. In this seminar, we'll look at the responses, proposals, our advantages as a region in dealing with the negative impact of the climate crisis in our countries. In this first panel, we'll look at the challenges surrounding green finance. We will have representatives from Ministries of Finance, Ministries of Economy, Environment, and Academia. We will hear their proposals and solutions. Now we're going to ask Mr. Graham Watkins, Chief of the Climate Change Division at the IDB, who will introduce the experts. Round of applause.
Me lo movieron.
Hay uno que es capaz de hablar se lo copié recién. No le dije que nos hagan una seña si no le dan.
Bueno, buenas tardes.
Very well. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're not falling asleep after lunch. Thank you very much for being here. I believe I heard earlier that this panel is the cherry on top, as many of the things we've been discussing over the last 2 days really lead to this panel and the following panel, which will touch on the private sector part of this topic. I'll provide a brief introduction. I'll speak a bit about the challenges that we are facing. Nothing new for us here, I believe. We'll talk about some solutions, but I want to emphasize something that we've heard throughout these discussions. We can only solve the climate crisis if we work together to promote this agenda, which is why we are here looking at the public sector side of this, and then we'll look at the private sector. I believe you don't have the title of this event up here, but I want to highlight something. We can do it. We can make progress on that agenda. It's tough, it's not easy, but we can do it. We will hear from countries that are leading the way forward. First point, we all know what we're facing, the impact. We see it daily. Yesterday we talked about the rain in Panama and people dealing with that. So there's changes worldwide in Latin America and the Caribbean. We've seen droughts, we've seen fires in the southern cones, hurricanes in the Caribbean. So there's no discussion, there's impact, and we need to do better to handle this impact. That's my first point. But in the context of yesterday's presentation, the impact is greatest on the poor, and that is really having an effect on our capacity to deliver on sustainable development in Latin America and the Caribbean. Second point, we all know that we have to reduce emissions. And on that, we do have a discussion that is very much focused on how to reduce emissions, but there is a subtext to all of that, which is that there is a change ongoing worldwide. I have heard others talk about this they call this change as big as the one in the Industrial Revolution. We are already seeing profound, far-reaching change worldwide. This is motivated not so much by emissions, in my belief, it's more so because renewables are currently cheaper than fossil fuel. So that's one element of this, but we're starting to see another wave of change which has to do with electromobility. In China, 12% of vehicle production is electric. Once you go past that 12%, that's when exponential change begins. We're starting to see those changes. We've seen growth of BOD buses. We've seen Tesla's growth. So change is happening, and change is exponential. And the challenge is, how can we be a part of that change? And that has to do with, one, making sure that we do not lose sight of our value chains. We need to stay ahead of this change. We cannot fall behind. And change is it's like a horse. Once it's off, it's not coming back to the barn. The horse is out of the barn. And that discourse, that narrative, is very different than one that focuses solely on emissions as far as solutions. One of the things that we have learned at the bank is that climate change is not just for the climate change division. It's cross-cutting. It applies to all sectors, all countries. It applies to all of the work that we do. All sectors will change. They're already changing. So it's a completely cross-cutting process. We'll speak a lot about this. We need financing to move the needle, to go in the direction that we need to. And we also need financial innovation. Without that change, we are not going to be able to motivate the countries to be a part of this change process. The banks can support the process, but I would say we are going to need between 470 billion and 1.3 trillion. The IDB group can deliver on 10 billion of that. So the burden of this is on the countries, and the need to change private flows and public flows is going to be very important to see where we get the money to make this change happen. Thanks to the entire panel. I know that it hasn't been easy for many of you to get here early. So thank you all very much for coming here. We are going to pose some questions to the panel. We're going to ask you to explain what's happening in your countries. We'll begin with Luis Miguel, who's done a lot of work with us on the knowledge agenda, on how much these changes are going to cost. And we'll begin with a question for you, quite a straightforward question. How much will this cost to meet the Paris objectives? Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And I apologize, my luggage didn't make it. I work for a tech company. And going back to the discussion on these issues, I think that in Latin America and globally, we need to understand that climate change is a development problem. In other words, climate change's impact on economic activity, on our well-being, on the environment are important because there are climate scenarios, economic studies that show that we could, over the long term, under some scenarios, lose up to 1/3 of economic GDP growth in Latin America. At the same time, in the mitigation agenda, we see that we need to have neutral activities that we need between now and 2050. That means changing production and consumer patterns very radically and very urgently. In that context, as Graham was mentioning, the estimates on the cost of this change, they vary a little bit. They go from 400 billion, 300 billion to about 1.3 billion, $1 trillion rather. And that has to do with the idea that we're continuously adding to this transition. We've talked about energy transition, but in order to have an energy transition, we need to think about a fair transition, and we need to include other factors, which leads us to some pretty impressive figures between 7 and 20% of Latin America's GDP. However, having said that, there's four considerations here some thoughts here that make it feasible. First, a large part of that is already being spent. The thing is, we're just spending it the wrong way. For example, when it comes to infrastructure investment, we need about 5 GDP points. Right now, we're spending at a little bit less than 3 GDP points. We need is those 2 additional GDP points. They need to be spent correctly. We need to increase the spending, but in addition to that, those 3 GDP points that are being spent, they need to be consistent with decarbonization. We can't just have those 2 additional ones focused on decarbonization, and the other ones would stay where they are. Another important change, we need to make adjustments to public policy as a whole. Green fiscal reforms, for example, eliminating subsidies for fuels, carbon taxes, that is an attempt to eliminate externalities, but they also tend to favor a double dividend, which means better income distributions through fiscal recycling and the rest. But we have several options within reach so that public policy as a whole works towards decarbonization. 3, another thing I think is relevant to discussion today, we know that economies that have a better income distribution, that are much more integrative, tend to emit less greenhouse gases. For example, if you have efficient public transportation that is used by most people, that overall is a reduction on emissions. That means we need a joint agenda between mitigation and enhancing income distribution and improving on reducing poverty. That means building a mitigation agenda, given the magnitude, the urgency of this. That requires social, economic, political consensus toward this mitigation, and we need to understand that this transition will be positive. It's going to have positive effects in terms of distribution, but also the engine of economic growth needs to be based on building this new energy matrix and the mitigation processes. And the last point I would make, which is part of today's discussion, something we were discussing earlier, is in Latin America, when we look at the household spending on electricity, water, and transportation, it's more or less about 20 to 25%. If costs continue to drop in renewables, we could offer electricity that is cheaper, much cheaper, and transportation that is much cheaper, which could in turn reduce spending in that segment of household budgets, which means spending would be available for other things. All of this makes it clear that while it's true that the investment required is quite significant, it really can be done through coalition, through consensus that covers these other fiscal policy matters, income distribution, changing spending patterns, and all of that goes through reimagining quality public services. What the future is going to call for, as many countries have already pointed out, is that we think about having an economy where at its core it has growth linked to deep decarbonization and building a sustainable economy. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a very big number. I hear it. But it can be done. We can do it. Policy can be changed to move forward, and the cost-benefit analysis, which shows that this makes a lot of sense for a country to move forward. Minister Marcel, I don't know how much I've read about Chile's success. a few weeks ago, we saw something on Chile being one of the top 3 countries in the world in terms of the climate change agenda. And not just in that, right? I think that you also have been awarded for the best long-term strategy in the world. So a lot of incredibly good things that are happening in Chile, that agenda is moving forward. The question for you is basically, how are we achieving the climate change agenda in Chile? How do we match it up with the economic agenda? How do we do that?
Great. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity of being part of this panel. Perhaps to start, I would say that it's interesting to see that in Chile there's been a lot of continuity over the last 3 administrations when it comes to climate change. We're talking about administrations of very different political stripes. Of course, there have been many differences, but when it comes to the environment, there has been a lot of common ground. For example, the targets to lower emissions and what was subscribed to under then President Bachelet, and then the continuity with President Piñera, and now what is continuing with President Boric. And I think that that creates a lot of value. Now, in terms of implementation and what has been done, perhaps one of the things to think about is how much work has been done to engage all industries. This is not only the government doing something or the Ministry of the Environment. This has brought in both government and the private sector. And this is why the climate change law, which you just mentioned, first make sure that the country's targets are actually legally binding. But building on that, it also creates challenges by industry to achieve those targets. That helps everyone step up and do their part. We have targets for lowering emissions of the different industries in livestock farming and transportation, and also specific CO2 targets per sector. We're also working on a green tax law that is going to bolster these targets and create better challenges for the sectors. And basically, this creates a cap and tax system per industry, which will give realistic and achievable targets per sector. But when you bring them all together, it helps us overall reduce, as a country, our emissions. As part of that bill that is going to be put up to a vote at the start of April, the amounts for emissions taxes are going to be reviewed, and also what the subsidy is and how that can be looked at when we think about electromobility and the polluting energies. Lastly, something that is very important for Chile, we have to think about the changes in our energy mix. This process started pretty much 15 years ago now. And thanks to that, Chile, which was a country that almost relied fully on fossil fuel imports, now has half of its energy generation coming from renewables. By 2025, that's going to be 65%, and by 2030, that number will be above 80%. These are all investments underway. So it seems to me that there was a vision, and I'm not only referring to more recent years, but actually going back further, there has been this trend, this continuity over time, which shows how seriously changes in the energy mix was taken, and that has given us a very significant advantage. This also brings us to something that isn't usually asked about. Chile is a country that, given its natural resources and the geographic features, is able to have a net benefit coming from climate change policies that we're seeing around the world, because we produce the kinds of raw materials that are needed for e-mobility, and also because we have renewable sources, particularly PV and wind, that help us not only be self-reliant when it comes to energy, but will also allow us to develop the green hydrogen industry. And we already have an initial plant in operation. Great. And of course, consistency and this long-term trend between administrations is key. And this idea that all industries matter and are engaged is also key. And the changes in policies and these subsidy rates, all of this makes it all very clear. Minister Arbeleche, Uruguay, is also a role model for the world. And that is always how we make sure to present it. For Latin America and the Caribbean, Uruguay is a leader when it comes to laying the foundation like Chile did. We see that you are also moving in the same direction, but also leading the charge around the world. In addition to that, recently, you issued the sovereign SLB bond, which is, as we see it, financial innovation. So the question for you is, what are the next steps when it comes to developing new instruments? Because new instruments will be necessary to really pick up the pace of change. And I'm referring to Uruguay, but also the other countries in the region. Good afternoon, everyone. At the outset, I would like to perhaps give some background for this point and talk about a number of issues you mentioned during the introduction. The first is global warming and climate degradation that is having an impact, as you mentioned in the beginning. You raised a number of examples. I will add what is happening in Uruguay. We're going through a significant drought in our country, and that has an impact on our economy and obviously on our society. Secondly, you mentioned some progress that has been seen around the world, things moving in the right direction. How these problems are being tackled. Uruguay is also making significant strides. We've seen progress in terms of the energy mix. We are continuing to move towards cleaner energy sources. We're currently going through the second energy transition. Uruguay has a lot of agriculture and animal and livestock farming, and we've reduced the carbon footprint over the last 30 years. Uruguay has reduced by 40% carbon emissions per product being grown. And you have also talked about how this issue is no longer just environmental. It cuts across different areas. And this is why the financial policy and economic policy needs to follow the same model. In our current spending bill, there is an article that explicitly includes the environmental policy within the government's finances and the overall economic policy for the country. Last point to add to this context, you mentioned this in the beginning. The climate shouldn't matter as policymakers only because of sustainability for the planet and well-being for people. It should also concern us because there is a new paradigm in front of us. The way that countries trade, how to attract investment, how we use products, all of that will have an environmental impact component. And so as policymakers, we need to try to get ahead of what is going to be traded, what is going to be invested, and it does need to have that climate seal. In a way, we're also making sure that we take good care of the growth in our economies that imply employment if we include an environmental component in our thinking. In terms of environmental and climate indicators, last October, Uruguay, after a lot of work, issued an SLB, a sustainability-linked bond that was linked to environmental behavior components, and that was a milestone for our country. And I would dare to say that that was also big internationally. Just a bit before that, Chile had come up with a similar instrument, and this was an important project, as Minister Marcel mentioned. With this bond, we have concrete indicators under the Paris Agreement that are going to now lead to consequences. In other words, fulfilling or not fulfilling these indicators now has a fiscal impact. In Uruguay, this is a symmetrical structure, which means that when you comply with the indicators, you pay less in interest, and when you don't, this is stepped up. You pay a higher interest rate, meaning that you are either awarded or penalized based on whether you're complying with these goals or not, which was slightly different from what happened in Chile, where it was only one of the two sides of that coin. There's also work being done on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There's an indicator that focuses on CO2 capture, and that is to keep the forests alive. We are going to be working on that label, deforestation free, and that is something that was included in our bond issuance. I also think it's important to think about the fact that there is an annual measuring of these indicators through this bond. They are verified by the UN program. And obviously, it's really important to be able to not only measure it, but get confirmation that these indicators are being met. In terms of what's next, we understand that when it comes to multilateral financial institutions, if we really want to keep moving forward when it comes to climate, if the costs are so high, as it was said in the beginning, we need to be doing more with similar innovative projects, emulating what Chile has done, what Uruguay has done. In other words, we're talking about loans from MDBs that will have an interest rate based on environmental behavior of a given country. We have been working with the IDB as well as with other MDBs to have an interest rate that is linked not so much on this two-way street structure as we have in Uruguay, but to actually have more benefits for the countries with better climate behavior. The proposal, perhaps what we would call the important next steps, would be for a reward for the countries that can actually contribute to a global public good, such as environmental stewardship. We believe that MDBs and lending institutions are in a great position to push that forward and to help us move ahead. Fantastic. Thank you very much for discussing agriculture, discussing forests, understanding that there are these changes, as we have seen, in renewables and now in mobility. Also on those bonds, we commend you for what you've done. That is a milestone for the world, but also it shows that Latin America can be at the forefront of what is happening around the world. Also talked about how important it is to work across areas and to link these things to fiscal and tax components that can help push this agenda forward. Max, I'd like to now move on to you. I have to say that the changes I personally have seen in the Dominican Republic and in the agenda have all happened very swiftly. What has happened over the last 5 years, I mean, we've seen things really move. We're talking about renewables. We're talking about a program we're seeing now on resilience and adaptation. It includes also taking into account fiscal markers for climate change. And Climate Week is something I should highlight too. This was in the post-pandemic. I mean, this is the first time we're getting together, or that was the first time I should say, and it was very challenging. And so the question is this: how can governments spend and invest more in climate adaptation and at the same time grow the economy, but link that to decarbonization? Great. Well, let me first start by thanking you for having me and for uh, allowing me to be here with all of you. I should say that every country decides how it is going to structure the government steps to address the climate situation. In most cases, countries will designate a ministry to take on that agenda. Many times, this is the Ministry of the Environment. Other times, it's the Finance Ministry. In the Dominican Republic, our solution has been different. The government has taken a different approach. We created a National Council on Climate Change and Free Development Mechanism. This government mechanism is very particular because it is presided over by the president of the country. The secretary of the council is the Minister of the Environment. But that is also something that includes the Minister of the Economy, the Minister of Finance, the Central Bank Governor, the Foreign Minister, and these are what I would call the productive ministries, the Ministry of Agriculture, of Industry, of Energy and Mines, and Tourism, but we also have the Public Works Ministry. As we see it, this sends a number of signals. The first is that by having the president of the country preside over the council, that already gives an important position to this issue on the agenda. Secondly, the fact that climate decisions need to be decided by a council, by this group of ministers, that's important, but it also addresses the issue of something that crosses a number of different areas. It is not about any specific interest of a given sector. This is about collective interests. And it doesn't have to do with what any one ministry believes is important, but rather, again, what the perspective is of the whole. There is an executive vice president in that council, and that is the position I hold, and this is why I'm here. All of this means that the council's offices believe they need to coordinate this work, that there needs to be a joining of efforts. And that means that the council, in a way, can be galvanizers. That means that every ministry can, from within its perspective, take on this agenda, looking at what ultimately is part of their responsibility, but this is a concert of ministries that take on all of these different dimensions. And so you have this cross-cutting perspective that brings everyone to be able to take on what is theirs to build this building. And we're seeing results because this coordinated action brings us to first to make sure that we are all on the same page within the government, but then there's also an advisory committee within the council made up of different entities and players from civil society, from the business sector, from academia. And in addition to that, you have, of course, this internal coordination, but there is external coordination. The external coordination means the government and also financing institutions. And I'd like to use a very concrete example here. Because we believe that money is important, of course. This is what we did. There were a number of EOIs that were launched by the CIF, the Climate Investment Fund. We actually participated in 3 EOIs and were able to win 2. And out of those two, I'd like to use one example. That expression of interest was on decarbonization, how to take steps towards decarbonization. How did we get there? Was it alone? Not at all. This is because we worked hand in hand with our partners. In that case, we're talking about the IDB. And I want to highlight this because alongside other governments, the US government, the Canadian government, it helped us actually achieve that selection. We got $85 million that was approved in January. And in that, as well as in other EOI processes that the Dominican Republic was able to win, we have asked the IDB for support for the investment plan. And that decarbonization process within the Dominican government is led by the Ministry of Energy and Mining. The Ministry of the Environment is part of the process, so the Ministry of the Economy is part of that process. And again, we do all of this with international support as well. But here's what else I'd like to add. The climate commitment. We know that this is a commitment for each country, and it is voluntary. And these are the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. How are those developed, at least in the Dominican Republic? That starts within the National Council on Climate Change. But within that council, there is a kind of board or committee that leads that work. And who is on that committee? It is the Ministry of the Economy, the Ministry of the Environment, and the Ministry of Finance. So through those mechanisms, we're able to have the broadest engagement possible in as coordinated a fashion possible. And in terms of outcome, we see that within each of those parts of the government, we are seeing a lot more excitement and interest. This is why the Ministry of Finance in the Dominican Republic is part of the platform of finance ministries against climate change, and this is why we also have a fiscal classifier. This is also why climate change can be found in the spending law, and something that is being negotiated right now, is being discussed, is with the IDB, we're talking about fiscal support that is linked to climate change for $200 million. All of this to say that this is how, in the end, all together, we can build this climate policy. And if I may, I have a final example. Thanks to IDB support, we were able to develop a study on the financial viability of decarbonization. And just yesterday, we got the results of that study, and it came with a few scenarios. What was the conclusion? If there's a clear and decisive action towards renewables, with a horizon of 2015, opting for renewables would help the Dominican Republic save $2 billion. And this is huge because we're always told that all of this costs money, but what we say is that you can actually save money with it. Thank you very much, and thank you for mentioning all of the institutional and government mechanisms that have been key. Again, this idea of a cross-cutting approach and bringing all industries together. You also talked about the role played by civil society. I think that's also important. And the coordination happening with external entities so that everyone is moving towards the same goal. And thank you for also mentioning what you've done with the IDB. Minister Ocampo, I think that there's no need for an introduction. Colombia has also been a leader on this agenda for a very long time. I believe just yesterday in the discussion we're talking about green finance, and this is something that started 10 years ago. So Colombia has played a key role on this agenda, and this for a very long time. Thank you very much for being with us. I know it was not easy for you to join us for this panel. My question has to do with what you believe the Finance Ministry's role is when it comes to Colombia's climate policies, and also what are the key climate focus areas for climate action in Colombia? Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at the annual meeting and also to be on this panel with all of my fellow panelists. Perhaps I can start by mentioning something that few have thought about, and deforestation was a key thing, and this was mentioned by the Minister of Uruguay. This has been at the heart of what we have been talking about in Colombia, and that is our key contribution to the climate fight. Now, we should talk about what can be done internationally to support that effort to take on deforestation. That's a key discussion. The Amazon Initiative has been led by Colombia and now has a lot of support, Brazil's new administration, but we also have the Pacific side of our country, which is incredibly rich environmentally and also with its biodiversity. So there are domestic efforts, but I think we need to do a lot more. What can you do to support the communities living next to the rainforests, or to provide more significant economic opportunities? And also talk about international effort. Traditional financing mechanisms simply fall short, if I can say it that way. This is a public spending issue, and there are different kinds of transfers that can be carried out through those mechanisms. In terms of the energy transition, I like to say that this comes down to three different dimensions. The first is energy generation. Colombia, when it comes to energy production, is pretty clean, mainly because of hydropower. That's our key source of energy. There are a lot of private projects right now that are underway focusing on solar energy throughout the country. So our energy is pretty clean, and I think we're moving towards being even cleaner. What's more complex is transportation, because that is where we're lagging far behind. We have truck transportation and bus transportation. We're moving towards cleaner transportation that can be either through more electric vehicles or with more gas. But also, let's think about automotive vehicles. The two car manufacturers in Colombia, this is in the news, are starting to manufacture electric vehicles. Renault just made the news yesterday with that transition, and that transition is going to be a lot slower. Obviously, there's a need for financing that is yet to be developed. The third is that we are gas and oil exporter, or I should say, oil and coal, rather. And so the issue there is what to do about that. As I said there in Colombia too, is that we have three transitions: the energy transition, the export transition, and the fiscal and tax transition. Three transitions. On the energy side, I already mentioned it. There's the tax component, which is really important because in the tax reform that was just approved 2 months ago, there was an excise tax, special tax for coal and for oil, especially looking at coal to produce energy. And there was also a tax for those with lower income that should incentivize cleaner generation, including biofuels, which is a significant topic in our case. The exports transition is important too, because we need to see how to rely less and less on these oil products. And when it comes to taxes, we need to see how to rely less on coal and oil, especially on our oil industry, which is a significant industry, but that needs to be diversified. Another important component here is that we have heard from a lot of investors about the importance of green hydrogen. We've seen that internally too with some of our oil businesses. For Colombia, this is a great opportunity. As a matter of fact, we had someone telling us that they would buy all of the green hydrogen that we could produce. And so that's an interesting discussion to have and could be an opportunity for our oil companies as well. Thank you very much. Thank you, Minister. Once again, just to discuss deforestation, that's key, biodiversity and climate change, all of that is important for our countries and our people. The idea of also thinking about the future and think about what we do with freight transportation, what changes there are in air travel, how to look at that, how to handle all of that, and the fuel of the future is really important as well too. And we also talked about the fiscal and tax role for helping to move the needle. Now, I think there's some concern around the time that we had, but I did request more time because this is an incredibly important panel and a really interesting one.
Avinash, thank you also for coming. I think it's very important that we give space to the Caribbean, being from Guyana myself, but I also think that basically Barbados has a lot of interesting things to say and is doing a lot of interesting things. And I just remember from going to COP27 and the largest crowds were with your Prime Minister. So Mia Mottley is certainly changing the world, to be honest, and it would be great to hear perspectives on what we're doing in Barbados. So, I mean, basically, you have carte blanche. You can basically talk about what you want to talk about, but the idea is really to say, you know, what are the kinds of key elements that we need to change to be able to move forward with this broader agenda of climate change?
Well, let me spend, thank you very much, and it's been a great pleasure to come here and speak to you and being on this panel with some great old friends. Let me say a few words about the Bridgetown initiative. So Bridgetown is not a place, it's a set of ideas. And these are ideas from the perspective of a borrower. So we borrowed a lot from the IDB, from the CDB, from the IMF, from the World Bank, and the perspective of a borrower who has a climate change problem. We are smack bang in the middle of that zone of the most climate vulnerable countries. Almost all of the members of the IDB are part of that climate vulnerable area between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, where the costs of climate change are 4 times greater than in the countries outside. But one of the reasons why climate change has such traction, I say to people, you know, we know from experience of being a small island development state, I say to my friends that if you're not a small island development state, you're not going to become one. But if you're not a climate vulnerable country, you may become one, unless we do enough on climate mitigation. So, I think the Bridgetown Initiative is well framed by where we began, with Miguel's presentation on the amount of money we need. Over $400 billion in our region. $400 billion. Now, if we put that all in our balance sheets, we'll all go bust. No one out there is about to write a check for $400 billion. And the private sector will do much, but it won't do everything. There are many things the private sector can't do. Bridgetown is a system of finance. It's a system of finance that recognizes that governments are not getting elected to send checks to foreigners. If anything, these days, governments are getting elected to deport foreigners, not to fund them. So we need to be recognize the world we're in. So we say there's a bunch of stuff that there's no alternative but to get a check. And that is loss and damage from climate. When homes are being wiped away, the homes of low-income people, if every time you've got to rebuild by borrowing money, we'll be sunk under oceans of debt long before the sea levels rise up. So we need a check for that. but I would say only write checks for that, for loss and damage. Don't write checks for adaptation and mitigation, because we can fund those things in other ways. Now, resilience. We need to become more resilient. Every dollar we spend on resilience, we will save ourselves $4 to $7 in the future. But there's no point being resilient in the future. We need to be resilient today. We need to bring forward resilience investing today. And for that, we need the help of the IDB, because we can't do that at commercial rates. So we need low-cost, long-term funding. We need new types of instruments that the IDB needs to pioneer. We need 50-year borrowing at the rate at which the IDB borrows at. And that will allow us to bring forward the amount of resilience that we need. And I would focus on resilience, which saves us money in the future, but has no real revenue stream. And most resilience is like that. Sea level increases, sea defenses, flood defenses, water management, not a lot of revenues out there. But there is a bunch of mitigation for which there are revenues. Moving to renewable energy, transport, agriculture. And there we need your help in helping to mobilize private savings into mitigation. Because the private savings aren't going to come just like that. The cost of capital is stopping them. The projects that make money in Germany and America don't make money in our countries. The cost of capital is too high. How do we reduce the cost of capital? I'm afraid to say our development banks basically shove it back to us. They say the reason why cost of capital is too high is because your policies are wrong. Your plans aren't ready. Your investment projects aren't good. It's the only set of banks I know in the world who blame the customers for not lending enough. But if you actually look at the spread of the cost of capital, 75% of the spread is made up between the spread of government borrowing. And that tells you that the bulk of the cost of capital problem is a macro risk problem. It's a currency risk problem. We need your help to develop systems that can reduce currency risk for people who are investing in the energy transition, the transport transition, and the agricultural transition. We need climate mitigation trusts that help to deal with a currency risk problem. And we believe we can do that, and the kind of organizations that can do that are the kind of organizations that you are. Long-term, patient capital in the center of a wide diversity of currency risk. And so we urge you to help us in limiting currency risk and attracting private sector savings into mitigation, into creating new long-term instruments for resilience, and helping us find alternative ways to fund loss and damage. And the final point I'd say is we also need another type of instrument we'd like you to be looking at, which is natural disaster clauses. You know, Barbados is the world's largest issuer in sovereign bonds of natural disaster clauses. And when we say we're the largest issuer, it means not enough people are doing it, because we're tiny. But these instruments reshuffle payments, gives us breathing space. The IDB offers us a contingent credit line that gives us 2% of GDP in a crisis. Natural disaster clauses give us 19% of GDP in a crisis. These are the kinds of things you need. No other instrument does it. And we want you to put those clauses in your borrowing when you're lending to us. Thank you very much indeed.
And thank you, Avinash. I'm afraid now we have sort of run out of time, but I did want to repeat a little bit the ideas. I mean, it's great to hear from a small island state and from a borrower directly. I do think the question of changes to financial systems is absolutely crucial. Thank you for bringing in the question of loss and damage that we hadn't really touched on much. The issue of providing lower cost for investment in resilience adaptation is key. The natural disaster clauses are very, very important, and we're trying to advance them as much as possible. And your point on mobilization of the private sector is the reason why we need to leave the stage a little bit, because we now have a panel exactly on the question of mobilizing private sector and how private sector can contribute. I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the inputs. Excelente. Creo que hemos...
Excellent. I believe we've offered a lot of information that can be a part of our discussion here at the annual meeting. So thank you all, and until next time.
Muchas gracias a nuestra.
Thank you very much to this distinguished panel, presenters, ministers, government officials, and academics, members of academia. Thank you, Graham. Moving on now to our second panel, we'll look at green trends and opportunities for the private sector in Latin America and the Caribbean, financial, innovative, and sustainable solutions. Hilen Midovic, head of climate at IDB Invest, will join us now. Round of applause.
Uy, sí, ahora sí se escucha.
How should I introduce this last panel of this conversation where we will talk about private sector opportunities? I think before we get into the nitty-gritty of this topic, I know that we're all committed to action, but having some numbers in mind helps frame the actions that we want to accomplish. The Paris agreements mention 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees, because we know that in a world with 2 degrees, that would be loss of coral, loss of biodiversity, a rise in sea levels. That's 2 degrees. When we look at the world we're striving for right now with the policies that we have in place with today's commitments, the UN published a report, it's a yearly report before the COP. We are currently aiming toward a world of 2.4 degrees. If we add private sector goals, that's 1.8. We're not there yet. We need to act, we need to commit, we need to change, we need to make the most of these opportunities for technological change. We recently heard from the public sector. The public sector already has initiatives underway. They are updating their goals. Ministries of Finance are part of the effort to create the conditions necessary to mobilize more private capital. So what do we have to do from a private capital standpoint? What do we have to do from the international context in order to mobilize climate action? That's a question that we asked ourselves at IDB Invest to think about how do we increase ambition in our organization? How do we raise the sector's vision in Latin America and the Caribbean? And in that context, as we were thinking about these things, we felt that the best thing we could do was put together a blue ribbon panel to have a conversation with them, to have a sounding board, as we say, someone to challenge our ideas in order to think about the priority areas for the work that we do with the private sector. Since 2016, we have been increasing our private sector financing, but we want to break that glass ceiling, as they say in English, in order to grow and to raise ambition. So we called on this blue ribbon panel, some of them from private sector companies in the region, some international. We brought in academia, and we also brought in people that are part of the sphere of international negotiations, like Selwyn Hart, who's part of the United Nations. Unfortunately, I can't show you all of the faces of the members, but we're fortunate in that today we have 3 of the members in today's panel. This panel was led by Mauricio Cárdenas. Then we have Maria Fernanda Teixeira, Liz Bronder from Bank America. Maria Teixeira is part of several companies in Brazil. I'll give you some more details when we get the panelists up on stage. But I do want to tell you that the work that we've done with this Blue Ribbon panel, this report, we had support from the Eurasia Group, and their help was for us to talk about trends, to look at what we should aspire to in order to have more impact with the work that we do. With that, then I'm going to ask Maria Teixeira, Mauricio Cárdenas, Liz Bronder, Shari, and also one very important part of this conversation as members of the panel. This has to do with the work done through concessional funds. So we also have Pasi, who represents Finland, one of the donors to a concessional fund for IDB Invest. And we'll get into the details of that in our conversation. Thank you all very much for joining us and sharing the Blue Ribbon panel's experience, as well as your experience in creating concessional funds for climate change, which is so important for the region. I would imagine everyone here is wondering, well, what are the trends, what are the opportunities that you've identified? The idea of this panel then is first we'll go to Shari, who is going to provide some background on these trends, and then we'll get into some specific questions for the panelists to hear their views from the work that they do, to see how we can take this toward a call for action so that you, the private sector in the region, can support this ambition so that we can hit this goal, which is 1.5 degrees. So Shari, with that, you have the floor.
Could you tell us a little bit about what the trends are that you're seeing and the opportunities that we see?
Sure, thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and also for working on this report. It's been really interesting. I'm Shari Friedman. I work at Eurasia Group. Eurasia Group is a geopolitical risk firm, and we look at trends around the world and how those affect businesses. And that's relevant in this discussion because we spend a lot of time, my group spends a lot of time thinking about sustainability trends. And so I want to grab a few of those trends and talk about how they affect businesses in Latin America. So you can kind of look at this in two ways. There's the environmental trends broadly, and then there's the geopolitical trends that affect markets, that affect green markets. And so I'll touch on both of those briefly. So starting off with the environmental trends, I mean, the one that everybody always thinks about, of course, is climate change. And it is, and the way that this is manifesting that's relevant for companies is many ways, but a lot of countries are taking on net zero targets. And what that means is they're moving toward decarbonization. By November, about 140 countries had either taken or are about to take on net zero targets. And whether they get there or not, they're moving toward decarbonization. And what that's going to look like is going to vary by country in terms of pace and the priorities there. But I think the main point to track is that the decarbonization is happening and that companies need to be aware of their carbon footprint. The next few trends come in on the other sectors that are sort of following behind. And we're seeing this in biodiversity, in water, in plastics. And the things that all of these have in common is that they're moving from environmental risk being sort of incident related. So no more is it like about spills or about toxic releases. This is about fundamental changes in the environment and the corresponding policies that systematically affect businesses. So for example, with biodiversity, you have biodiversity loss that is affecting companies. So you're seeing that with agriculture, you're seeing it with clothing, you're seeing it in retail. And then you have the commensurate policies that are trying to reduce biodiversity loss, and then those affect companies because they affect companies like mining and they affect real estate. So you're starting to see this, whether you believe or not or whether you're paying attention or not, they're going to affect the companies. And we're seeing this also in water. This year, for the first time, water was one of Eurasia Group's top risks that companies need to be thinking about. And it's not just that water is becoming more scarce, it's that policies and governments are going to be making decisions about who gets the water. So as we think about these, the next trend, I think, as you think about this being systematic, is that financiers are paying attention to this. They want to know that the companies that they're investing in are positioning themselves to thrive in an environment where you maybe not have the resources that you had before or where policies are changing. And so this is where disclosures come in. There's a lot of investors are looking at disclosures. They're wanting to see how companies are positioning themselves. And this is becoming mandatory in some countries, including some countries in Latin America. But whether you're in a country where it is mandatory or not, it's still relevant to the companies in their ability to attract global capital. Another way that I think that this is important is in trade. And environmental factors are increasingly moving into the trade conversation in a much more substantive way. And the way that the piece everybody knows right away is the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, where the European Union has put a carbon price on some sectors, and then some subsector of that, they're going to put a price at the border for imports coming in from countries that don't have a commensurate price, on a carbon price for those materials. So that's clearly going to have an impact on on many of the companies. So then you also have global trends, just broad geopolitical trends that are affecting the green markets. And so I can't, of course, have time to go into all of them. That would be a very long talk. But just taking the US and China decoupling, this is going to mean the US and also Europe, their very aggressive green agendas rely a lot on materials and on finished products coming in from China. And as they decouple, that's going to create opportunities for other markets to be providing those. Both countries are trying to build their own capacity, but if China takes a more aggressive stance inside of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, you're going to see this decoupling happening at a more rapid pace, which means that there's going to be a lot of movement on trying to find kind of friend shoring. So all of this creates opportunities in a lot of different sectors. It creates opportunities in energy, in renewable energy, in green buildings, in sustainable agriculture, in processed mining, in manufacturing of a lot of the goods that countries need to develop, like iron and steel and glass, and how can those be manufactured more sustainably. So those are some of the trends that we're seeing, and of course they have to be balanced with developmental goals as you're starting to think about this through the IDB, and that's what this conversation will be about. And so with that, I'd like to pass it back over to Aline.
Thank you so much, Harry. Maria Fernanda, I'll ask you the next question, but before, let me tell you, Maria Fernanda is a board member of companies including Raya, Drogasil, Grupo Simpar, Grupo Vamos, Clarinet Technology. She's a chair of the board of the directors of Perola. She has been an executive for over 30 years in multinational companies, reaching the C-level at some of the largest technology and payment companies in the world. She was recognized by Forbes as amongst the most influential executive women in technology and business. So thank you so much, first of all, Maria Fernanda, for joining the Blue Ribbon panel, for joining the process, the conversations. And since you're involved in so many board meetings, I wanted to ask you about the trend that Shari just mentioned regarding net zero strategies. Is that part of the board conversations that you've seen? What are the takeaways of those conversations at the boards?
Well, first, thank you, Helene, and thank you, IDB, for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. And let me tell you that the answer is yes, yes, and yes. Lots of companies. It's amazing, but in the last 3 years, the companies are really, really working hard now, understanding the challenge that our planet has, and working hard on that. So it's really amazing, the changes that I have seen in the boards, as well at the top executives. I'm gonna mention some examples to you. Last week, we had the United Nations. They held the ambitious 2030 forum in São Paulo. Basically Brazil, but it was in São Paulo. We never saw how many CEOs and board members together. We had more than 1,000 CEOs and board members in this one-day forum committed. We have already in Brazil more than 2,000 companies that are signed the Ambition 2030 Pact. So this is really, amazing in less than, 2-3 years. In all boards that I'm part of, the ones that you mentioned, yes, they do have, ESG, not just climate change, in their agendas, and they are really committed, all the boards. And another thing that helps, and this is a tip here to all of you, when the audit committee comes and say, we have to include climate change in our risks and measure materiality, then everything changes. So that's another thing that and I'm the one doing that. I'm the one bringing it to the board. And it works, because then, the board members get a little bit scared because other board members are bringing that, and they start. For sure, it's something new. It's really hard for the companies to really measure the materiality of climate change, but it's happening. Let me give you another wonderful example. For some companies, it's really hard for them to say, how do I start, right? So my recommendation is always try to identify a certification, right? Because if you align a certification and you really committed the whole company with the ESG initiatives, and it works. So normally I recommend corporate B certification. And just to give you an idea, one of the companies of Grupo Simpar is called Movida, is a rental car company. They were the first company in the world to receive B Corporate in the rental car business. So it really works. If you define, some certification, the whole company gets committed. There's another company that it's new. I'm just new there, and they produce batteries. And you can imagine the challenge, right, in companies producing batteries. But they have investing a lot of money in the lithium batteries as well. They are creating a new business that became an opportunity with clean energy. So, but I need to tell you one thing. In the technology company that I'm part of the board, they work with cybersecurity, clouds, and it's pure technology. And when I started there, I said, I'm going to be there only if we create an ESG committee, and if we start really working on that. Do you know what the CEO did? He said, wow, we have a big opportunity here, right? So he personally, because he's one of the shareholders of the company, he started buying farms and land 2 years ago. So now he has a commitment that by 2025, means only 3 years, he will be with 10 million plants or trees planted. It's just to give you an example of how opportunities come, because he says, well, I'm going to be positive, net positive, and by the way, I'm going to sell credits. So in the private market, it's amazing what's happening, and I'm so happy and so excited that things are moving.
No, thank you so much, Maria Fernanda. I think that you show that the leadership of all these companies have to be engaged, and I think we see that. We see more and more CEOs and board members being engaged and committed to this agenda. The same happens in the public sector, right? We just heard it from the panel before, that if you have a president that is so involved in the policy making, then you have real change in also the public policies of the country. Liz, I'm going to move to you, but again, before I ask the question to Liz, let me tell you that Liz Bronder is the Managing Director of Global Sustainable Finance in Bank of America. She's an expert in sustainable finance and impact investment with a focus on development finance, working with development finance institutions in emerging markets. She advises issuers and financiers institutions on sustainable development goals and social bonds, as well as impact measurements and management. She has delivered structured investment and innovative advisory solutions to firms and governments, and she advises venture capital and global development boards. And again, Liz, thank you so much for having been part of this panel. I think a lot of the conversations we had on how to increase capital mobilization were very much guided by what you were seeing. So why don't you, share with us, how do you see the capital mobilization from private sector, the opportunities in the region in comparison to other regions of the world, because you work in different emerging markets, and so the Latin American region may have some peculiarities?
So thank you very much, Hélène and IDB Invest, for this invitation to join you all for this important conversation. So first, to say that the call to action to private financial institutions really began in Addis Ababa when it was determined that we would never reach our goals for sustainable development without the private sector. And the private sector financial institutions have really embraced this, and especially for climate, set their own goals. So I think that that's the first thing, as you were saying, that to actually have your own goals for net zero, that means not only what you do for yourself in scope 1 and in scope 2, how you use energy in your own operations. Those are easy, let's say, for a bank to achieve. But scope 3, where you're really trying to help your clients achieve their net zero goals, is really what is going to take us into a decarbonized world. So we have been very active helping our clients, but we've also introduced new products. I think the green bonds, sustainability bonds, which we've heard a number of governments and issuers in Latin America have used, have been very important. And we've also introduced, which is maybe not a new product overall, but for our institution, project finance, which helps us to deploy our own balance sheet. And we've actually found this to be easier for us in Latin America than in some other regions, because there are companies and governments here that are setting their targets that are looking for these opportunities. There are institutional investors that are looking for these opportunities. And so we've been able to work in a number of different countries to bring about these climate-oriented financial solutions. And what we've learned from deploying our own balance sheet is that when we're working in some of the larger countries in Latin America that have deeper capital markets, we can do this on our own. We can bring investors to these markets. But some of the countries are smaller, and this really requires this partnership that we seek with multilateral development banks. And we have in just the last few months been able to partner with IDB Invest on a B loan that we did for renewable energy in the Dominican Republic, and also for a very large B bond, which was issued by a telecommunications company in Costa Rica. So these are the types of markets that benefit from financial institutions being able to bring private capital, but also from the partnerships with the development banks that have deep relationships with governments and important standards that they set in this area.
Thank you, Liz. And I think both examples are very innovative. The one in Costa Rica, not only the structuring, but working with the telecom company that was doing the first SLB as well, of defining the KPIs. As we were hearing in the previous panel, the KPIs is important to actually get the impact later on and to monitor that that impact is very, very important. So Mauricio, I'll pass it on to you, but again, before I ask the question, let me just read a little bit of his resume, not all of it, but he's a professor of professional practice at CIPA right now and a former finance minister of Colombia. And he's also the director of the MPA in Global Leadership at Columbia University, School of International Political Affairs, and a Global Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Global Energy Policy, where he conducts research on energy and climate policy. He served as the Colombian Minister of Energy in 2011 to 2012, and then as the Colombian Finance Minister from 2012 to 2018. So Mauricio, you know that part of the conversations of the capital adequacy framework, the CAF review, and also for the first time, the COP in 27, they call for MDBs to work and to do more on climate, right? And you had the opportunity to be the chair of the panel, you talked with all the members of the panel, and then you presented the report to our CEO, James Scriven, and also to the president, Ilan Golfan. And you talked a lot about climate, changing the climate mindset. What does that mean in terms, we talked just now on leadership, but what does that mean and how do you see that applying to the region?
Well, thank you very much, Ellen. It's actually a great privilege and a great honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me and thank you for being here. I'm delighted I'm sharing the panel with two members of our Blue Ribbon panel, Maria Fernanda and Liz, and Shari, who was so instrumental in putting together the views in a magnificent document that I really commend you to read, because it's really one piece that gives good perspective about what the challenges are ahead. You mentioned I was finance minister. Yes, I was finance minister. 8 years ago, the annual meetings of the IDB took place in Busan, in Korea. And those were memorable annual meetings because it's the year in which the shareholders of the IDB came together to the idea of creating the IDB Invest. And IDB Invest has already been doing great things during the last 8 years. Last year, 30% of the transactions that IDB Invest were in climate finance. So that's about $2 billion, which is fantastic. But we need to take the IDB Invest to the next level. And this is the reason why this panel was convened. And essentially understand what the trends are in the world and in the region, and transform that into action for the IDB Invest. So the main conclusion is that demands are really high, demands on climate finance. And they come from responsible corporations like the ones that Maria Fernanda just described in Brazil. They come from banks, commercial banks, investment banks, like Liz was mentioning, that want partnerships, that want to work together. But they also come from the world in which we live that faces many threats. And among those threats, climate is one of them, food is another one, energy, and certainly protectionism. Shari mentioned the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which eventually could impose tariffs on products that come from countries that do not enforce carbon prices or do not have serious climate policies. So the region has a lot of demands. And the IDB Invest should become, and that's the goal, the leading green bank for the private sector in the region. And this involves a new mindset. This involves not just changing in terms of the focus and in terms of the operations, it's also mentality in terms of the way projects are assessed. It's also a new mindset in the way the IDB Invest interacts with clients, because many clients will need advice, will need help internalizing these trends, transforming these trends into concrete projects. But it also means that IDB Invest has to step up the game and requires more funding, requires more capital. The IDB Invest has done a lot with the capital it was provided at the beginning. It was, I have to say, small, But now, really, to accommodate all these demands, the institution needs more capital. And I think that's the pledge, that's the main ask we're making to the shareholders in this report. And let me tell you why. Because the IDB Invest plays a very important role that no one else is going to play. In some countries, it can complement the local financial sectors, help de-risk some of the projects. But in other countries, it could mean also the origination of new projects, the seed capital to be able to develop the projects, and concessional funding, because otherwise it's going to be difficult to get the ball going. And here I'm thinking in terms of countries in the Caribbean, countries in Central America, so we need that type of support. So the job is huge. The first 8 years have been remarkable. The next 8 years could be even more transformational for the region. I am a true believer that as the world has so many challenges, so many threats, so many multiple crises, Latin America can be part of the solution this time around. Less than be part of a problem, could be part of the solution. We have the biodiversity to help the world deal with climate change. We have the water. We have the land to be able to produce food with a low carbon footprint. We have the energy that the world needs as well. And we have also a great location in a peaceful hemisphere. We're a region that is not going to threat anyone, that is not going to cause wars, that is not going to cause conflict. So we are the poster child for friendshoring. But all that requires capital and requires financing. And that's the reason we wrote this report.
Thank you, Mauricio. And Pasi, I will ask you the next question, but again, I will introduce you, Pasi Hellman, who is serving as the Undersecretary of State for Development Policy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. At the Foreign Ministry, he has previously worked, among other things, as Deputy Director General and Director of the Unit of the Department for Development of Policy. Hellman was the Managing Director of the NDF, Nordic Development Fund, in 2012 to 2018, and served as the Board of Directors, member of the board, on the Board of Directors of the ADB, Asian Development Bank in Manila from 2004 to 2007. He has served in the embassies of Finland in The Hague, Nairobi, Board of Directors of the Asian Development Bank in Manila. Pasi, as you just heard, Mauricio mentioned concessional funding. The report highlights the need for advisory services, concessional funds, and also the work with the public sector in this collaboration of partnerships of doing the right policies for then enabling private sector to invest. We recently signed a concessional fund with Finland for blended finance resources for IDB Invest. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about the fund?
Well, thank you, Elen, and thank you very much for the kind invitation to this very important panel. And I'm particularly pleased that as a representative of the public sector, I've been invited to a panel on private sector together with other panelists from the private sector. I think that really shows and hopefully sends the signal that how important the interplay and collaboration between the public and the private sectors are. I, of course, very much welcome the work that IDB and IDB Invest have done to expand their climate finance business and to also to diversify the climate portfolio. And the fund that you mentioned, which was established in December by Finland and IDB Invest, focusing on supporting green transition and improving resilience and adaptation capacity in this region, and where Finland put in 50 million euros to support this work. I think that's a demonstration of our thinking that you really do need concessional funding to support this kind of transformation, green transition in many countries in the region. And also then, of course, to catalyze, to unlock more private investments for these purposes. I was I actually worked with the IDB earlier in the previous capacity when IDB was developing something called NDC Accelerator to support countries to reach their nationally determined contributions and to help and improve in project preparation and really to accelerate the process, the progress towards reaching the NDCs. And there also the case for concessional funding, advisory services, project preparations were really important. Of course, for us, for Finland, because we have committed to make our own transition to carbon neutrality in a fair way and in a way that ensures that no one is left behind. So that's the reason why this fund with IDB Invest will also focus its climate investments on the poorest and the most vulnerable countries and communities, and also pay close attention to gender equality, diversity, inclusion, and things like that.
Thank you, Pasi. Maria Fernanda, one of the questions that came in the panels before during the day today was the issue of the S within the ESG, right? The social. We shouldn't just talk about transition, but we should talk about just transition. We had just before a gender equity panel. What can you tell us about the S, so important for the region, and how it links to the concept of climate change?
Yeah, this is extremely important, especially if we talk about Latin America and Caribbean. We see a lot of poverty, a lot of hunger, a lot of people living on the streets right now due to the economy crisis, or favelas increasing more and more. So my point is, we in the private sector, we have no way to have perennity if we don't look to the S, right? Because S is not just diversity, right? Diversity is important, as we heard in the last panel, or one panel before, but it's not only that. What are we doing to, reduce the gap that we have in our region from the rich people, median, and poor people? It just increases the number of poor people. So the companies have a responsibility. So that's why the S is so important now. How are we going to connect the E, that we talked a lot about it, and now the S, how can we improve the conditions of people? And G is key, in my opinion, because if the private sector that makes decisions much faster, the private sector do not need to wait for legislation to make change, right? And private sector is much faster. So we can make a lot of difference with the G, because if we have a good governance and we include in the G a lot of targets that includes the E, and most of companies are focusing on that, but they are not really focused on the S. So for me, right now, I am the one provoking the private sector, saying, guys, there is no way to keep our globe with this number of people with hunger, living over the streets or living badly houses. So for me, it's the three letters, but I would change the order, right? I would include G first, then the other two, because they are equally important, but the G is key for me.
No, thank you so much, Maria Fernanda. I think that part of the issue is that we have to understand the context where we're operating, and definitely the social agenda in the region is very important. Yeah. And I think that the driver or the enabler could be, as you just mentioned, the G. Another important point of the context where we operate is the biodiversity, and the fund that we just signed with Finland had a very important component or mention of biodiversity. Pasi, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, thanks. I think it's actually quite simple. Climate change and biodiversity loss are really inseparable and sort of interdependent threats in our world to the humankind. So they must be addressed in an integrated manner. I think the COP15 biodiversity COP that was held in Montreal in December after quite a lot of delays because it was supposed to be held in Kunming, China much earlier, but I think that meeting helped, I think, all of us to understand really the importance of biodiversity and really brought that issue on a higher level in the international agenda, and really makes us understand that well-functioning, resilient ecosystems are actually helping us to adapt and mitigate climate change. Now, this region, of course, Latin America and the Caribbean, is very rich in biodiversity, and I think if we can find ways to support opportunities in this area, I think the private sector also can play a very important role in sort of avoiding biodiversity loss and increasing conservation. And maybe lastly on this, the earlier panel, there was a reference made to the International Global Coalition of Finance Ministers on climate change, which is actually an initiative which was co-initiated by Finland and co-chaired also by the Finnish finance minister. But that coalition has agreed certain principles for climate finance that the finance minister should take into account, and that group has also made a recommendation to establish similar principles for biodiversity financing. So I think that's something that should be looked more closely into in the near future.
Thank you, Pasi. And I think that another question is, how do we innovate to include biodiversity and nature with the climate agenda? And maybe, Liz, can we brainstorm on what you have seen on possibilities of doing more of these financial examples that you mentioned before, but moving beyond renewable energies and to the biodiversity space, and even more to the adaptation space? Because as we know, our region is one of the regions that is most affected by climate change. And I remember in the conversations of the Blue Ribbon panel that you mentioned that we need metrics, but those metrics should be also from the market, right? We shouldn't invent something that it's not then taken on by the market. So what are your take? What are the opportunities there?
Yeah. Thank you. So I think, first of all, there's some important lessons that we can learn from how things have worked well in the past. I mean, what we see is that setting targets is actually very important. So when companies are setting net zero targets, when countries are setting decarbonization targets, that really galvanizes innovation and thinking about how are you going to meet that. And the opportunities then become huge because there's this need to be creative, to have new ways of solving these climate issues, and the technology development has been enormous. We're looking at green hydrogen, carbon capture, carbon sequestration, and these are all needing to be developed, invested in, and then adopted by countries and also by companies. And the green economy is also just developing. So electric vehicle manufacturing, solar panels, all kinds of different services are new and ready for new entrepreneurship, new investment, and have a lot of potential. But in addition to all of the technology solutions, the nature-based solutions are really fundamental, because you cannot solve biodiversity with technology innovations, at least not that we know now. So Latin America has an incredible opportunity to really invest in and make everyone aware of what can really be done when you're preserving nature, conserving nature, and adapting to the changes that climate change is making. So I think the opportunities are both in the sort of industrial technology sectors as well as in the nature-based solutions, which we try to support by focusing things on, let's say, blue bonds or different types of ways and approaches and programs that can really drive financing towards these kinds of nature-based conservation programs.
Thank you, Liz. Mauricio, hearing all these trends towards the future, the areas of opportunities is there in terms of sectors, but also of instruments, what are your views that how are these trends going to move forward in the region?
Well, and listening to these last part of the conversation, I think it's a very important element, because I guess the main point here is we're very worried about greenhouse gas emissions. We're very worried about climate change, and it's good that we're now much more aware of about that, but it's not enough. We need to make sure that we cover a much wider spectrum, because it's not just about greenhouse gases, it's also about the loss of biodiversity. In fact, some of the interdependencies that are related to climate change, for example, in the case of health, are related to that aspect, to loss of species and changes in the seas, coral reefs, etc. So we have to think in a wider framework, and that's the importance of the COP15 on biodiversity. It elevated the discussion, and it created the type of awareness. What this means is that when we come to the projects and we come to financing, it's not just about the reduction in emissions. We have to worry about issues, for example, related to waste, the circular economy. We have to worry about the way we manage water, the treatment of water. So the list of projects is much bigger. The use of plastics, for example. So all these point in the direction that since we're in the early stages of these new kind of like era for the IDB Invest, it's good to put this in the blueprint of what the action will be, which is let's finance projects, for example, that reduce waste, or that encourage the circular economy in different corporations, in different industries. And those are as important as the ones that reduce emissions. So it's that wider framework. And let me say that this involves also an introspective view of the production processes. So firms becoming a lot more aware of what they're doing, and trying to change things. It's not just about government policies. It's not just about regulation. It's also about consciousness. It's also about thinking in terms of what the consumers want. And the consumers are asking for this. So this is an important driver. It's not just that we're going to follow what the norm and the regulations and the laws are saying. It's a lot of this is market driven. And I would say that one particular aspect of this that is very relevant for Latin America is food production. So very important in the production of soy, of cattle. Latin America is very rich in that. But we have to ensure that we continue doing that in the context of respecting and defending our biodiversity. And this is the idea of restorative agriculture, producing biofuels of second, third generation. This is very important, and I think this is the area in which we have a lot of work to do, many projects to finance, many ideas to develop.
Thank you, Mauricio, and thank you all for coming to to be part of the Blue Ribbon panel, the process, PASI, for joining the private sector panel. So let me just conclude with these few words. We know we have to act now. We have to do transition plans for the private sector companies, but we know it's not easy. It is a hard process, but we're here to help you. We're going to be able to support you in that process. We want you to know that either the private sector companies or the governments know that IDB Group is there to support that transition, not only a regular transition, but a just transition mainly. And also with a focus on biodiversity and adaptation. We know that otherwise the vulnerable peoples will be most affected by the impacts of climate change. So we want to act now. We need to start now, because otherwise we're running out of time. We have to invest in the future we want, and we have to start now. So with that, thank you so much for coming here, for joining us outside somewhere in the world, and for being with us in IDB Invest. Thank you. Thank you.
Y muchísimas gracias a
Thank you very much, Helen, our moderator. Thank you all here in the Panama Convention Center, and our audience worldwide joining us on digital platforms via the IDB. Now, if you want to explore some more, if you'd like to see these discussions again, you can do that through the IDB's streaming channels, so that you can see the solutions and what's being done both in the public as well as the private sector, as well as by civil society in our region. Thank you very much, and until next time. Thank you, Jose. Until next time. Bye.
I want to tell you about something that is very important for me, for all of us really. It's something we need to play, to dance, to dream. Without it, our lives are very difficult, and sometimes we don't have it at all. That's why we need you. In the Caribbean, we face many energy challenges. We have hurricanes and earthquakes that may leave us with no electricity. We depend on oil imports, and they are expensive. You need to solve this fast. You need to